Having a bath or shower is something that most of us do every day. But did you know that in the 18th century, people rarely, if ever, took baths? So what did they do instead? How did they keep clean? Did they keep clean? Hi, my name is Bose. I have an MA in Early Modern English History, and on this channel we talk about the history you don't learn about in school. And this week, we're going to explore personal hygiene in 18th century England. In this video we will discuss, was personal hygiene important to people in the 18th century? How did people keep clean? Why were baths so unpopular in the 18th century? Who did take baths? And the rising popularity of bathhouses in the long 18th century. Firstly, was personal hygiene important in 18th century England? Firstly, to avoid any confusion, I'm going to define what I mean by bathing. Bathing is the act of immersing the body in water and washing it. Now, this act was pretty uncommon in the 18th century, and you do get people actually complaining in writing about having to have a bath. For example, the courtier and diarist John Evelyn wrote that he was resolved to wash, but only once a year. However, that is not to say that people in the 18th century didn't want to be clean, or that they weren't clean. Actually, people in the 18th century put in a lot of effort sometimes to smelling clean and looking presentable. It is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that the past was a very smelly place, what with the lack of underground sewage systems and the fact that deodorant was not invented till the 19th century. But people in the 18th century, and before that, wanted to look good, and they wanted to smell and look clean. And while germ theory would not be popularised until the 19th century, medical belief in the 18th century said that bad odours could cause sickness, so people tried to get rid of anything that would cause bad odours, and would prioritise cleaning themselves and their surroundings in order to avoid this. So, how do people keep clean? Well, many people simply used a jug, a bowl, and a washcloth. They would use these items to wash the intimate areas of the body, as well as those visible to the public, so the head, the neck, and the hands. A number of surviving 18th century recipe books contain recipes for soap making in the house. So it was something that people could have made for themselves, but it also could have been bought from a range of different shops in 18th century England. The most expensive soaps were made out of whale blubber, and they could be scented with flowers or essential oils. And while not everyone in society was able to afford soap, that didn't stop people from prioritising trying to smell good and washing regularly. People likely use this method of washing at least once a week. But, as washing is today personal preference, some people might have done it much more frequently, and some people might have tried to stretch out time between washes. Another method of cleaning oneself was to use a dry piece of linen and rub it over the body. People also tried to keep clean by changing their undergarments, the layers of fabric closest to their skin, as frequently as possible. The late 18th century is also when we have the rising popularity of new tools to keep the body clean. Business records from perfumers show that in addition to the perfume sold, they also sold body soap, hair powders, toothbrushes, and tongue scrapers. These last two reflect an increasing interest in oral hygiene by 18th century elite. Some perfumers also sold skin products, which would often be scented, although their primary purpose might have been to get rid of wrinkles. For those with disposable income, the late 18th century perfume shops offered a range of ways to scent the skin and make it smell more appealing. So, why were baths so unpopular? Baths were incredibly labour intensive. The vast majority of people, unless you were incredibly wealthy, did not have running water. In order to have a bath, they would have had to get the water into their house first, which would have involved going to a well or another body of water, which could have been over a mile away from their house. Then they would have to get the water back to their house. And you need more than one bucket of water for a bath. So either multiple people would have had to go to collect water, or multiple trips back and forth to the water source would have had to be made. And then you have to heat the water. Now, first of all, heating multiple buckets of water on a fire, on a range, is going to take time. Secondly, you're going to waste valuable coal and wood doing this. So, for many people, having a nice warm bath was too labour-intensive and too expensive. So now you might be asking, why didn't people just have a cold bath if they couldn't afford to heat the bath? Well, if you imagine it's the middle of winter in England, so it's probably raining, if not snowing. It's cold, your house doesn't have any central heating, and you might not even have the fire on if you're trying to save money. And if you do, it's not quite as effective as modern radiators. So the room is cold. Getting into a cold body of water is not only unpleasant, but it can also lead to illness and sickness. And this is one reason why baths were incredibly unpopular. In case you're now thinking, then why didn't rich people like having baths? After all, they had plenty of servants to fetch them water and firewood or coal in order to heat the water up. And the answer is that some of them did like to have warm baths. For instance, a couple of centuries earlier, Henry VIII altered several of the royal palaces, including Hampton Court and Windsor, to have running water in his bedchambers so that he could have a bath. However, there are still some factors that put off even the wealthiest in society from having a bath. For starters, there was contemporary medical belief that disease could enter the body through the pores of the skin, which would open when in warm water. Another is that water from a pump or well would not have been cleaned in the same way that water that comes out of a tap today is. So it was likely dirty, quite possibly visibly dirty, especially if you were living in a crowded city. So for a lot of people, the idea of submerging themselves in dirty water was not very appealing at all, hence why the bath was quite unpopular still with even the aristocratic in 18th century England. So, who did take baths? Those who lived in rural areas with access to naturally cleaner water might have felt very different about this and might have quite enjoyed having a bath. So, how was having a bath different in the 18th century than it is today? Many people who had baths chose to keep either their closest undergarments on or wear special bath dresses. Part of this was for modesty, because if they were wealthy enough to have a bath, then there's quite a good chance that there's a servant in the room with you or just on the other side of the door. So for modesty's sake, a lot of people opted to have clothes on in the bath. Secondly, a lot of baths would have been made out of wood. Now wood splinters. So people would often line the bath with linens in order to protect themselves from splinters, in addition to wearing clothes in the bath. But what about bathhouses? Bathhouses are a staple of many 18th century novels, but somewhat ironically, their main purpose was not actually for washing. Bathhouses rose in popularity in the 18th century, with wealthy individuals building private bathhouses on their estates, as well as public ones which could be used for a fee or membership, established in towns like Tenbury Wells and Bath. In England, the popularisation of public bathhouses can be traced to the Romans, and today 20 Roman bathhouses survive in England under the care of English heritage. These were popular in medieval England, but over time they would become associated with being fronts for brothels. So, multiple English kings passed regulations on them, and they became less desirable places for polite members of society to spend their time. However, this would change in the 18th century, when a number of social factors meant that antiquity and the rise of Roman civic ideas gained popularity, especially among the elite. As a result, Roman ideas such as public bathhouses were brought back into fashion. There was also medical belief at the time that submerging the body in cold water could be beneficial to one's health. So these bathhouses were more about medical ideas and social activities rather than actually washing yourself. And they were only really available for the wealthier in society. This has been a little introduction into personal hygiene in 18th century England. Not all the techniques for keeping oneself clean in the 18th century have been discussed, so if you know any more, please drop them in the comments below. I hope you've enjoyed this week's video and that you've learned something interesting. That's all for now. Bye!